Hey guys! Tonight we're drifting into a pale, calm forest where the air smells like damp leaves and clean wood because this episode is about birch bark and the quiet ways people used it to stay warm, dry, and safe. If you like slow, cozy history like this, everyday materials, old survival tricks, and gentle routines, subscribe and we'll keep building these soft little worlds together. Now, imagine rain that doesn't storm, it just arrives. A thin, persistent drizzle that turns paths dark and makes every surface feel slightly slick. In places with long, wet seasons, northern woods, lake districts, tiger edges, cool mountain valleys, waterproofing isn't a luxury, it's a daily negotiation. And birch bark is one of the most polite negotiators nature ever made. From the outside, birch trees look almost too bright for a damp world. Pale trunks, black scars, a papery skin that peels in curled strips like old parchment. But that paper isn't fragile in the way it seems. It's layered, oily in a subtle way, and full of resins that dislike water. Rain beads and slides, snow melts and runs off. Even when the air is humid, birch bark tends to resist soaking through quickly. People noticed all of that long before they had chemia, chemistry, words for it. They noticed it when they leaned against the birch in the rain and found their cloak slightly drier on that side. They noticed it when a fallen birch log stayed slow to rot compared with softer woods. They noticed it when bark peeled in wide, usable sheets, light to carry, easy to cut, and oddly stubborn against water. So they began to treat birch bark like a portable roof. Not a perfect roof, not a forever roof, but dry enough, often for the exact moment when dry matters most. Bark as a seam, a skin, a shield. If you walk into a small woodland settlement in a rainy season, you might not see birch bark immediately. It's not always displayed. It's tucked into seams and corners where water tries to sneak in. Look at a simple hut roof. Layers of poles, then brush, then turf or thatch. Where the roof meets the wall, where a ridge line runs, where a smoke hole threatens to drip, there, thin sheets of bark appear like quiet insurance. They're laid like shingles, overlapped so water always meets an edge that points downward. Sometimes the bark is under the thatch, hidden, acting like a second sky beneath the first. On a windy night, when rain is driven sideways, it's often this hidden bark layer that prevents the slow disaster of damp bedding and dripping ceilings. And because birch bark is light, people could use it in places where stone or heavy clay tiles weren't possible. One person can carry enough bark for repairs. A child can bring strips for patching. It's a repair material that fits into the rhythm of daily life. Soft work, quick fixes, no dramatic construction. Containers that don't panic in the wet. Now come closer to the door. Someone has a small box in their hands, pale and smooth, the surface marked with fine lines. It's a birch bark container, folded, stitched, or laced with roots. These containers are one of the quiet miracles of bark technology. People stored salt, dried berries, tinder, needles, herbs, fat, even precious powders in them, things that hate moisture. And the bark protected them. Not like plastic, not like a modern vacuum seal, but like a patient lid that refuses to absorb water quickly. The seams might be stitched with spruce root, sinew, or thin strips of bark itself. The lid fits snugly. When rain hits it, droplets sit on the surface like tiny glass beads, then roll away. If you've ever tried to keep fire-starting material dry in wet weather, you know how deeply comforting that is. Canoes, lakes, and the lightness of survival. In some regions, birch bark becomes even more ambitious. It turns into boats. Not heavy, carved-out logs, but light craft. Frames of wood ribs covered in bark sheets, sealed with resin. These boats don't fight water by brute force. They work with it. They float gently, shallow enough to skim over reeds and slip into quiet bays. They can be carried between lakes, portaged, because bark is light and cooperative. And what seals the seams? Often resin or pitch, sometimes mixed with charcoal or fat, warmed and pressed in. Birch bark itself contributes too. Its natural resins help the structure resist wetting and swelling. On a still morning, you can imagine a canoe sliding through mist, the lake's surface smooth as slate. The canoe is quiet, not only in sound, but in philosophy. It's a thin skin over water, carefully made, carefully maintained. The bark in your pocket. Even if you never build a boat, bark can travel with you. A traveler might carry a roll of bark as an emergency rain layer. A hunter might wrap dry tinder inside it like a protective envelope. A herder might use a strip as a quick splash guard between a wet load and a wool cloak. Bark becomes a flexible tool. You don't have to know exactly what you'll need. You just know water will show up, and bark is one of the easiest things to ask for help. And then there is the quiet craft of lighting fire in wet conditions. Birch bark, even when damp on the outside, can often be scraped to reveal drier inner layers. Thin curls catch a spark quickly. A small flame appears, gentle, reliable, like a lantern turning on in the forest. In damp climates, that ability isn't a trick, it's comfort. The soft lesson. If this all sounds simple, that's because the best survival materials often are. Birch bark isn't loud. It doesn't shine like metal. It doesn't demand the complex workshop. It just offers a calm resistance to water over and over through roofs, boxes, seams, and boats. And that's why it belongs in a sleep story. Because the feeling we're chasing tonight is not victory over nature. It's cooperation with nature. It's the sense that when rain arrives, you are not helpless. You have layers. You have overlaps. You have seams sealed gently with resin and patience. So while you're resting, imagine a piece of birch bark in your hands. Pale, flexible, lightly textured. Imagine laying it over something you want to keep safe, like a warm loaf or a bundle of tinder, or even your own thoughts. The day's worries can be like drizzle, persistent, clinging, unnecessary. Bark doesn't fight drizzle. It simply refuses to soak in. Let your mind do the same. Let the worries bead, roll, and slide away. And in that quiet waterproofing, soft, layered, patient, you can drift toward sleep.
At the end of the day, waterproofing isn't a roof or a canoe seam or a clever wrap. It's a habit. It's the small ritual of noticing what got damp, drying it a little, and then closing it away again. So the next day starts with readiness instead of hurry. Birch bark fits this ritual perfectly because it is, in a way, a material designed for closing. It folds, overlaps, latches, ties, caps, covers. It turns open things into protected things with a few calm motions of the hand. So tonight, for this segment, we'll rest in that closing motion. Fold, overlap, tie, hang, and the gentle quiet that follows. The world starts wet, and that's okay. In rainy forest regions, people didn't wake up expecting dryness. They woke up expecting moisture. Dew on grass, mist in low places, damp air in the corners of houses. Dryness was not the default. So the goal was never perfection. The goal was dry enough in the places that mattered. Dry tinder, dry socks, dry bedding, dry needle and thread, dry knife edge, dry food stores. If those stayed protected, a household could handle rain. Birch bark became the material of that dry enough strategy. Evening routine, the quiet reset. Imagine an evening inside a small cabin. A fire glows low, not roaring, just steady. Tools are put away. Someone shakes out cloth near the hearth. Boots sit where warm air can reach them. And on the table are bark things, little pale objects that look simple but carry a lot of security. A tinder wrap, a needle tube, a berry box, a small pitch pouch. The routine is calm. First, check. A person opens the tinder wrap and feels the curls. Still crisp? Good. If slightly damp, they spread them near the fire for a few minutes. Not too close, too much heat can make them brittle or crumble. Just near enough to let warmth work. Second, dry. A small knife is wiped before sliding into its bark sheath. A needle is checked for rust and dried. A cord is loosened and hung so moisture can leave it. Third, close. This is the satisfying part. The bark wrap is folded. The seam is overlapped downward, so rain can't climb into it later. The tie is wrapped neatly, not knotted in frustration, just secured. The lid is pressed down until it fits with that soft, papery firmness bark has. Fourth, hang or store high. Bark boxes go to pegs or shelves above the damp floor layer. They sway slightly as they settle, like little pale lanterns without light. And then the day ends. The dry things are protected. The house doesn't need to worry about rain during the night because the important supplies are already sealed. Closing is a boundary. There's something deeply human about this. Closing a lid is a boundary. It says, this is handled for now. It says, not everything needs to stay open. It says, I can stop. People who lived with wet weather learned that boundary early. If you leave things open, dampness enters quietly and ruins them by morning. If you close things properly, the morning starts easy. So the act of closing becomes a kind of peacemaking with the climate. You can almost hear it. The soft press of a lid, the whisper of bark folding, the slide of cord tightening, the small tap of a box set onto a shelf. These are bedtime sounds. They're the sounds of readiness. The little geometry of calm. Even closing has the same gentle geometry we've seen all along. Seams face downward, edges overlap. Openings are covered, not exposed. The vulnerable parts are inside the protected parts. This is roof logic, canoe logic, and mind logic all at once, because water and worry behave similarly. They look for openings, they follow seams, they seep in where things are left loose. And the solution isn't panic, it's overlap. A sleep ritual you can borrow. Now, if you want a calm way to move into sleep, you can borrow the bark ritual without doing anything physical. You can imagine packing your thoughts into a bark box. Choose one thought you keep touching, like a sore tooth. Place it gently in the box. Put a lid on it. Press it down. Wrap a cord around it once, twice, just enough. Hang it on a peg high in a warm, safe place. And then do the same for another thought if you need to. You don't have to throw thoughts away. You only have to store them where dampness can't ruin your rest. A cozy last scene. Imagine the cabin going quiet. Rain is still tapping the birch-bark roof. The fire is a soft orange eye. The air near the ceiling is warm. Along a wall, bark boxes hang in a neat row. Each one holds something important. Each one is closed. Someone looks at them once, satisfied, not proud, just relieved. They don't keep checking. They don't keep opening. They trust the system. They settle into bedding. The rain whispers with birch. The bark does what it always does. It refuses to soak quickly. It guides water away. It keeps seams quiet. And sleep arrives not like a sudden event, but like a slow lowering of the world's volume. Everything is closed. Everything is protected enough. You don't need to stay alert. You can rest.
Birch bark is famous for what it does in the rain. Beading water, shedding drips, refusing to soak quickly. But some of its most useful work happens when the rain isn't even touching it. It happens indoors. It happens in quiet corners, on shelves, under benches, in lofts and cellars, where the real enemy isn't a sudden downpour, but slow, constant dampness that tries to creep into everything you own. Tonight, we're going to look at birch bark as an indoor technology, storage that stays dry enough by being light, layered, and breathable. The problem: damp that you don't notice at first. In wet climates, you can keep a fire going and still lose a war against moisture in the background. Cloth feels a little clammy, metal tools haze with rust, powdered foods clump, sewing thread grows musty, and your best spark bundle, your tiny hope of flame, turns into a sad, wet lump. This kind of dampness is sneaky because it doesn't announce itself. It arrives gradually. It lives in air, not only in puddles. So people created systems for separating dry things from wet life. And birch bark, once again, is ideal because it is resistant to soaking, light enough to hang and move, easy to fold, stitch, and replace, and is breathable enough not to trap condensation the way some sealed containers can. It's not a perfect barrier, but it's a smart one. Birch boxes, the quiet furniture of survival. A birch-bark box can be small as a hand or large as a loaf of bread. Some are round, some oval, some rectangular. They can be made by folding a sheet and stitching the seam, or by bending bark into a cylinder and fitting a base. Often they're reinforced with thin wooden rims. Sometimes they're decorated. Etched patterns, dyed strips, neat stitching lines. That decoration isn't only beauty, it's also identification. This box is for needles, this one for herbs, that one for salt, that one for tinder. In a household, bark boxes become invisible infrastructure. They keep life from dissolving into damp chaos. What goes inside? The most important bark box items are the ones that fail quickly when wet. Tinder curls for fire starting, matches or flint supplies in later periods, needles, thread and buttons, sharp tools, small blades, owls, dried herbs for cooking or simple remedies, salt in small household amounts, and dry food, dried berries, mushrooms, seeds. A bark box doesn't make damp air disappear. It simply slows it down and prevents direct contact with wet cloth or wet floors. It keeps things organized so they aren't left out where they can fail. Hanging storage, keeping dry above the damp. In many damp houses, the floor is the wettest place. Even if it's not visibly wet, it's cooler, and coolness invites condensation. So people store important dry items higher, on wall pegs, on shelf boards, hung from rafters, tucked into loft spaces. Birch boxes are perfect for this because they're light. You can hang them from a cord without pulling down the peg. You can move them quickly. You can cluster them in the driest part of the room. If you imagine a cabin interior, you might see a line of small, pale boxes hanging near the ceiling, above the gentle warmth of the hearth. The fire's warm air rises, drying that upper zone more than the floor zone. The birch boxes live in that dry layer, like birds roosting in safety. Breathing versus sealing. A modern person might think, why not seal everything tightly? Because in older homes, tight sealing can create condensation. If you trap slightly moist air inside a sealed container and move it between warm and cool areas, moisture can collect inside, little beads forming where you don't want them. Birch bark is interesting because it resists water, but doesn't always behave like a hard, sealed jar. It allows tiny exchanges. It doesn't trap moisture as aggressively. This can help keep contents from sweating. That's what storage that breathes means. Not open to wetness, but not fully suffocated either. The discipline of dryness. The real secret of good storage isn't the container. It's the habit. People who did well in damp climates were often the ones who practiced simple discipline. Don't leave tinder out overnight. Don't put a damp tool back into a dry box. Let a wet needle case dry by the hearth before sealing it. Don't store salt near the door where damp air enters. Check boxes when weather changes. It's small stuff, but small stuff is what prevents big annoyances. You can picture someone at the end of a day, sitting near the fire. They open a bark box of needles, take out a few things, then close it and hang it back up. They add new tinder curls to a bundle. They wipe a knife dry before sliding it into a bark sheath. Their movements are slow and automatic. And that's the feeling we want tonight. Calm housekeeping, no urgency, just quiet order. A cozy closing scene. Imagine a rainstorm outside. The roof holds. The fire is steady. Inside, the air is warm near the ceiling, cool near the floor. Along the wall, bark boxes hang from pegs. Each one has a soft lid and a little cord loop. They sway slightly when someone walks past. A person checks the tinder box, smiles at the dry curls inside, and closes it again. They tuck a small pouch of herbs into another box. They hang a needle case where smoke and warmth will keep it safe. The world outside is wet, but inside there are islands of dryness, small, controlled spaces where important things remain ready. And you can treat your mind the same way tonight. You don't have to make everything perfect. You only have to put the important things, your calm, your breathing, your rest, into a safe box inside you. Hang it high where the warmth is. Close the lid gently. Let the wet day stay outside. Let your inner storage stay quiet, orderly, and dry enough. Sleep is like that, a protected shelf above the floor of daily worries. So you can drift up there now, into the warmer air, into the steady place where things are kept safe.
In wet climates, the problem isn't only staying comfortable, it's staying well. Dampness softens skin, and softened skin breaks more easily. Cold water numbs fingers, and numb fingers make clumsy mistakes. Small cuts happen often. Knife slips, fishhooks bite, splinters hide under nails. And in a world without modern antiseptics, a small wound can become an annoying, lingering thing if it stays wet and dirty. So people learned a quiet truth. If you can keep a wound clean and dry enough, you can keep it calm. And birch bark, once again, helped. Not as a miracle cure, but as a practical material for covering, shielding, and organizing little medical tasks. Bark as a clean surface. Before you can treat a cut, you need a place to work. In the rain, the ground is not a place. It's mud and leaf rot and tiny invisible life you don't want near an open scratch. So people used bark as a portable, clean table. A sheet of birch bark laid flat becomes a surface where you can place a needle, a strip of cloth, a small tool. It sheds water, it doesn't soak up grime quickly, and it can be replaced easily. If you've ever tried to do careful work outdoors in wet weather, tie a knot, repair a strap, you know how comforting it is to have a clean surface under your hands. Bark as a shield over a dressing. Birch bark itself is not soft like cloth. You wouldn't want it directly on a wound for comfort. But it can serve as the outer layer, a rain shield. Picture a small cut on a finger. The inner dressing might be clean cloth, moss in some cultures, or a strip of linen. Over that, a thin bark plate can be tied on as a rigid cover. It keeps mud and rain from rubbing into the dressing. It keeps the cloth from turning into a soaked sponge too quickly. It's like a tiny roof for your skin. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to buy time until you can wash properly and change the dressing. Splints and stiffness. Bark is naturally stiff in the right thickness. A curved strip can support a sprained finger or protect a bruised knuckle while you keep working. It's light and easy to shape with a knife. A thin bark splint tied with cord, simple, quick, can turn painful movement into tolerated movement. It won't heal bones by itself, of course, but it can keep a small injury from being aggravated. In older daily life, that mattered, because rest was not always available. Keeping hands clean enough. Water is everywhere in these landscapes, but clean water is not always convenient in the moment. So people practiced clean enough routines. Wiping hands on a dry cloth kept in a bark wrap. Keeping small medical supplies in bark boxes so they stayed drier. Using resinous smoke or warmed water to reduce dampness on tools. The bark box is important here. If your needle and thread are always damp, they rust and mildew. If your clean cloth is always damp, it stops being clean. So bark containers helped keep dry items separate from wet life. This is not glamorous medicine, it's logistics, and logistics often matter more. Birch bark and birch itself. In many cultures, parts of birch have been used in traditional remedies. bark infusions, leaves, sap. But tonight we'll keep our focus on the simplest, safest role, bark as material rather than medicine. Because even without drinking anything, bark can help by preventing the wet world from constantly interfering with healing. Dryness is sometimes the best medicine. The quiet bandage kit. Now imagine a small first aid bundle from centuries ago. Not labeled, not standardized, just practical. Inside a bark wrap, a strip of clean cloth, a small needle and thread, a few cord pieces, maybe a resin lump, useful for waterproofing the outer layer, a little knife for trimming bark splints. This bundle doesn't cure infection, it doesn't replace doctors, but it prevents small problems from becoming bigger ones by keeping things organized and protected from rain. Sleep-friendly scene, the gentle fix. Let's end with a calm scene, because calm is the point. It's a rainy afternoon on a forest trail. Two travelers pause under a birch stand. One has a small cut on their knuckle, a bright line of red, nothing dramatic. They sit on a log. The other person opens a bark wrap carefully, like opening an envelope. Inside is a clean strip of cloth, still dry. They rinse the cut with a little water from a bottle, then wrap the cloth around it. Over that, they place a thin bark plate, curved to fit. They tie it gently with cord. The outer bark sheds rain, and the inner cloth stays cleaner. It's like a tiny roof for your skin. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to buy time until you can wash properly and change the dressing. So, the person with the knuckle cut might feel a little bit of relief, a little warmer hand, a little less mud on the dressing. And you can borrow that feeling as you rest tonight, the feeling that small pains can be covered, small problems can be handled gently, and you don't have to be exposed to everything. Your mind can be like that hand, protected by layers. A soft inner layer, comfort. A firm outer layer, boundary. A calm knot, breathing. Outside, the wet world goes on. Inside, your small, tender places are safe enough to heal. And that is more than enough to let sleep arrive.
If bark roofs are about keeping rain out, and bark wraps are about keeping small things dry, then birch-bark canoes are about something even more delicate, trusting a thin skin to hold back a whole river. A canoe made of birch bark is not a heavy thing. It does not push water away with weight. It persuades water with shape, seams, and maintenance. It is a floating lesson in quiet waterproofing, lightness plus care. Tonight, we'll drift alongside that lesson, slowly like a canoe gliding through fog. The canoe as a forest idea. A birch-bark canoe begins as a conversation between materials. Birch bark for the outer skin, cedar or other light wood for ribs and gunwales, spruce root or similar fibers for stitching, pitch for sealing, and human patience for everything else. The magic is not any one ingredient, it's how they fit together without forcing each other. The wood frame gives shape, the bark follows, the stitches hold, the pitch closes the remaining tiny arguments water wants to start. The seam, where the river negotiates. If you look at a finished canoe, the bark panels overlap and meet along long seams. Those seams are sewn with root fiber in tidy, repeating stitches. The stitching is strong, but stitching alone still leaves tiny holes. Water will try them all.
So pitch is applied along the seam, pressed in, smoothed, warmed, and left to settle. At first, the seam looks slightly raised and dark. Over time, it becomes part of the canoe's look, a black line in a pale hull. It's not hidden, it's honest. It says, "This canoe is held together by care." Now picture a calm morning on a northern river. Mist hangs low over the water, softening the far bank into a gray blur. Alder branches lean over the edge. The surface is smooth, except where a fish breaks it with a quiet circle. The forest smells like wet earth and leaf mold, like cold stone and clean sap. Two people bring a canoe down to the water. It's light enough that they don't grunt with effort. They lower it like you would lower a sleeping animal, carefully, gently, respecting its thinness. The canoe touches water and floats immediately, as if relieved to return to its element. One person steadies the bow. The other steps in, feet placed softly on the ribs, weight spread. And then they push off. The canoe glides. This is the kind of movement that doesn't hurry. Each paddle stroke is quiet, and between strokes, the canoe continues on its own, carried by the river's slow decision. Why lightness matters. In a landscape of lakes and rivers, lightness is freedom. A heavy boat traps you in one waterway. A light canoe lets you travel between waters. You can lift it and carry it over land, portage, around rapids, between lakes, past fallen trees, across narrow ridges. The canoe becomes part of your walking life, not only your floating life. Birch bark is a perfect skin for this because it gives coverage without weight. It doesn't need to be thick to resist water. It needs to be layered and sealed. But here's the quiet truth. The canoe is not finished forever. Bark flexes, seams warm and cool. Pitch can crack in cold conditions. A scrape on a rock can open a tiny path for seepage. Even sunlight can dry and stiffen pitch over time. So canoe travel includes a maintenance rhythm. Not occasional emergency repairs, but regular small care, like washing your hands or sharpening a knife. Imagine a canoe stopping at a sandy bank mid-journey. The paddlers pull it partly onto land and turn it slightly to inspect the hull. They don't panic. They don't assume disaster. They simply look. If they see a tiny crack in pitch, they fix it. They take out a small bundle, resin lumps, charcoal dust, a bark cup, maybe a flat stick. They make a tiny fire, just coals, not flames. They warm the pitch until it softens. They press it into the crack, smooth it, and wait for a few minutes to cool. Then they launch again. It's a gentle pause, a repair that keeps the journey smooth. The canoe as a portable workshop. This is one reason birch-bark canoe culture feels so calm to imagine. Repairs can happen almost anywhere. You don't need a shipyard. You need a riverbank, a little heat, and the same materials already around you. The forest supplies resin. The fire supplies warmth. Birch supplies bark cups. And your hands supply the method. Waterproofing stays close to the traveler, not locked away in a distant workshop. Listening for leaks. Experienced paddlers even learn to listen to their canoe, not in a mystical way, just practical awareness. A canoe with a small leak sounds different. A faint drip might be heard inside. A small dark wet line might appear along a rib. Weight distribution might feel slightly changed. None of this is loud, but people who spent days on water noticed quickly. And because they noticed quickly, they fixed small problems before they grew. Soft images for sleep. Now, let your mind drift with one simple river scene. The canoe moves through mist. Paddle enters water with a quiet dip, pulls back. Water beads on bark and slide away. The seam lines are dark and smooth, recently sealed. The hull stays dry enough. On the bank, birch trees shine pale through fog. Drops fall from leaves lazily, one by one. Somewhere a bird calls once and then stops. The air is cool enough that breath looks faint. Everything is slow. Everything is held together by small attention. And that is a wonderful thing to carry into sleep. Because sleep is also a thin skin stretched over a moving world. It doesn't stop life. It simply holds you safely while time flows. So you can practice the canoe habit tonight. If you notice a crack, a small worry opening, don't panic. Warm it with a calm breath. Press in a little reassurance. Smooth it over. Let it set. Then drift on. The river will carry you. The bark will hold. The seams will stay quiet. And you can let your mind glide into rest as gently as a canoe sliding through morning fog.
A roof keeps you dry when you are still. A bark box keeps your tinder dry when you carry it. But when you have to move through wet grass, over mossy stones, along muddy paths, waterproofing becomes more personal. It becomes clothing, footwear, and quick repairs performed wherever you happen to be standing. In many forest regions, birch bark helped here too, not as a full shoe in the modern sense, but as a liner, shield, splash guard, and emergency patch, a portable layer you could add when the day turned wetter than expected. The problem of wet feet. If you've ever had damp socks for hours, you already understand why old communities cared so much about feet. Wet feet mean heat loss. Wet feet mean blisters. Wet feet mean slower work and more mistakes. Traditional footwear in many regions, leather shoes, rawhide moccasins, woven shoes, felt boots, could resist light dampness, but boggy ground and steady rain eventually win. Water comes in from above, through pent cuffs. It seeps through seams. It splashes in from puddles. So people used layer logic again. Accept some wet outside, protect the inside. Birch bark is perfect for that because it is thin, flexible, and reluctant to soak. Bark insoles and liners. One quiet trick is simple. Bark insoles. A person cuts a birch bark sheet to the size of their foot, smooth side up. It goes inside the shoe or boot like a thin floor. Above it, a sock or a foot wrap. Below it, leather or woven sole that may be damp. This layer does not make you magically waterproof, but it slows seepage. It keeps the damp from touching the felt or cloth directly. It also adds a bit of stiffness and insulation, like standing on a very thin wooden board rather than directly on cold, wet leather. In wet seasons, this can be the difference between uncomfortable and bearable.
Some people used bark as a full inner sleeve. Thin sheets wrapped around the foot and ankle, then slipped into the shoe. It's like a quiet raincoat for your foot. Again, not perfect, but surprisingly helpful for a day of work. Splash guards and leg wraps. Water often enters from above, so another bark trick is a splash guard. A wide strip of bark can be wrapped around the lower leg over wool wraps, then tied. It forms a stiff collar that sheds splashes and keeps wet grass from pressing directly into cloth. It also helps keep pant hems from dragging in puddles. This might sound awkward, but bark is light, and after a few minutes it becomes just another layer, like adding an apron or gaiter. If you picture a woodcutter or a herder crossing wet meadow in early morning, the bark guards help in a quiet way. Dew and shallow puddles hit bark first, then roll away rather than soaking into fabric immediately. Quick patches, seams, and holes. In the field, gear fails. A leather seam opens. A mitten tears. A strap snaps. And wet weather makes every small failure worse. Once water gets into a glove, your fingers stiffen. Once water gets into a boot, your day becomes long. So people used layer logic again. Quick patches, seams, and holes in the field. Gear fails. A leather seam opens. A mitten tears. A strap snaps. And wet weather makes every small failure worse. Once water gets into a glove, your fingers stiffen. Once water gets into a boot, your day becomes long. So people used layer logic again. Birch-bark offers quick patches because it can be cut on the spot and tied down. A torn mitten can be backed with a thin bark plate and stitched or laced through existing holes. A boot seam can be covered with a bark strip and tied around the foot to hold for the walk home. A cracked wooden bucket can be wrapped in bark and cord as a temporary bandage. These fixes aren't pretty, but they work. They buy time. And that's often what survival is. Buying time without panic. Bark and mittens. Warm hands in damp air. Hands are like feet. Once wet and cold, they lose skill. So people sometimes line mittens with materials that stayed warm when damp. Wool, fur, moss. Birch bark could help as a wind and damp shield. A bark strip placed on the outside of a glove across the back of the hand can shed sleet and stop wind penetration. It acts like a thin armor plate. It doesn't cover the palm where you need grip, but it protects the exposed part. In heavy wet snow or icy rain, that small shield can keep the glove from becoming saturated too quickly. Repair culture, the calm of fixing while moving. What's soothing here is not only the material, but the attitude. Birch-bark waterproofing teaches you to fix small problems early. You don't wait for the boot to fill with water. You don't wait for the mitten to tear all the way. You notice the first weakness and you add a layer. This creates a culture of calm repair. Imagine two people pausing under a birch stand when rain thickens. They don't complain loudly. They take out a small knife, cut a bark strip, and wrap it around a boot seam. They tie it with cord. They tuck hems. They adjust packs. Then they keep walking. No drama, just maintenance. The quiet sound of bark work. If you listen closely to bark being cut and folded, it has soft sounds. A faint crackle when bent. A light rasp when scraped. The whisper of cord sliding tight.
Those are gentle sounds, reassuring sounds, the sounds of control returning. A sleepy closing scene. Now, let your mind settle into a small rain scene. You're on a forest path at dusk. The air is damp. Leaves drip. Everything smells green and wet. Two travelers pause under a large birch. One kneels and slips a bark insole into a boot. The other wraps a strip around a torn mitten and ties it off neatly. A small fire isn't even needed, just hands, bark, and cord. Rain keeps falling beyond the shelter of the tree, but here, for a moment, you've created a little pocket of dry enough. You've turned trouble into a quiet fix, and that's the feeling to carry into sleep. You don't have to make everything perfect tonight. You only have to add one small layer between yourself and the day's dampness, one breath, one relaxation, one gentle repair. Birch bark does not panic. It simply becomes a barrier. So you can too. Let your thoughts settle. Let the wet world stay outside. Let your inner layers keep you warm.
A roof is a big promise. It protects a whole room. But most of life happens in smaller pieces. A hand closing around a knife, a traveler lifting a pouch, a child carrying berries, a cook trying to keep tinder dry long enough to wake a morning fire. This is where birch bark shines in its most daily, most comforting way. Not as a grand structure, but as a quiet wrap, light, simple, and always ready to be folded around whatever you're trying to protect from wet air. Bark as a pocket of dryness. Birch bark is thin enough to bend, but layered enough to resist water. If you fold it around something and overlap edges, rain has a hard time finding a straight path inside. In a damp world, that's an incredible feature. So people used bark the way we use plastic bags and wax paper, only calmer, more natural, and often more beautiful. Imagine a small household in a rainy forest region. The door opens and someone comes in, shaking droplets from their cloak. In their hand is a rolled piece of birch bark tied with a strip of fiber. They set it down near the hearth and untie it. Inside is tinder. Dry, pale curls shaved from birch bark's inner layers. Maybe a little bundle of dry grass, maybe a resin lump. All the ingredients for fire, still safe despite rain outside. This is not fancy, but it is everything. Because a wet house without fire is a cold house, and a cold house can become dangerous quickly. The tinder bundle ritual. In many traditional routines, a good tinder bundle is treated like a small treasure. It's not left casually on a wet table. It's kept in a bark container or bark wrap, hung from a beam, placed in the driest corner. You can picture the routine. Evening, someone checks the tinder wrap, makes sure it's still dry. Morning, they open it carefully, take out a few curls, and close it again. Bad weather travel, they tuck it inside a coat, bark side outward. After use, they refill it with new curls and reseal it. The bark wrap becomes part of the fire's daily life, like a quiet helper that never complains. Food wraps, berries, cheese, and fat. Birch bark also handled food gently. A handful of berries gathered in late summer, blueberries, lingonberries, whatever grows in that region, can be carried in bark baskets or folded trays. The bark keeps them contained and offers mild protection from rain and crushing. It also avoids the sour, wet feeling of cloth sacks that soak through quickly. Cheese and butter, too, often benefited from bark. Fat hates water in a particular way. Water makes it spoil, but it also makes it taste off. Wrapping butter in bark or storing it in a bark box keeps it away from sudden dampness and helps it hold its shape.
In some places, small bark containers held rendered fat, a precious fuel for cooking and light. The lid fit snugly, the bark resisted leaks better than rough cloth. The container could sit near a hearth without immediately turning into a soggy mess. Knife sheaths and tool covers. Tools are vulnerable in damp climates. Metal rusts, wood swells, knife edges dull if they're constantly wet. So bark became a kind of lightweight armor for small items. A simple knife sheath might be made from bark folded around the blade and stitched along the edge with root fiber. It isn't as durable as thick leather, but it's quick, light, and surprisingly effective. A traveler could make one in an evening, then replace it when needed. Small awls, needles, fish hooks, and sewing supplies could be kept in bark tubes, rolled sheets tied at both ends. These little containers kept the sharp things from being lost and kept them from being constantly damp. Even a compass-like sundial, a small carved charm, a bit of flint, anything that needed to stay dry enough to work could live inside bark. Flint and steel and the problem of wet sparks. Before matches, a spark is a small miracle you have to protect. Flint and steel firemaking depends on dry tinder. The spark itself is quick, but the tinder must be ready. If everything is damp, sparks die on contact. So the bark wrap becomes the secret partner of flint and steel. Imagine someone kneeling near a cold hearth in the morning. Outside, rain taps at the bark roof. Inside, it's dim and cool. They open a bark bundle and pull out dry curls. They place them under a small tinder nest. They strike steel against flint, sharp, bright clicks. A spark lands, the dry bark catches it, glowing, then blooming into flame. That moment, tiny light in a wet world, is one of the quiet triumphs of birch bark. Travel. The bark roll in the pack. Bark wraps were also travel objects. Lightness matters when you walk. Bark is light, and unlike cloth, it doesn't soak up water easily. So a traveler might carry a bark sleeve for tinder, a bark wrap for dried food, a bark sheet for quick rain cover over a bundle, a bark tray to melt resin near coals, a bark cup in an emergency. It's a toolkit made of one material, adaptable to many needs. And because bark can be harvested and shaped without heavy equipment, it suits the pace of life away from large workshops. You can make what you need close to where you need it. The fold logic of waterproofing. If you want to get very calm and precise, you can think of bark wrapping as a kind of gentle geometry. Water travels downhill. Water follows seams. So you fold seams so they face away from the rain. You overlap edges so water always meets a lid rather than an opening. You tie a wrap so it closes upward, not sideways. It's the same logic as roof shingles, but in miniature. That's why the same people who knew how to lay bark on a roof also knew instantly how to fold bark around a bundle. The hand remembers the rule. Always lead water outward. A cozy ending image. Now let your mind settle into a small indoor scene, warm and quiet. It's evening. Rain is steady outside. Inside, near the hearth, a person sits and makes bark wraps. They cut a strip cleanly, fold it, overlap it, tie it with a thin cord. Their hands are unhurried. Each finished bundle looks neat and pale like a small sealed envelope. One is filled with tinder curls, another with dried berries, another with a little knife and needle. They are lined up on a shelf where smoke and warmth will keep them dry. The work is gentle, the results are reliable. And you can borrow that reliability tonight. Imagine your thoughts as small items you don't want soaked. Wrap them in overlapping calm, tie them shut with a slow breath, place them on a shelf inside your mind where they can wait safely until morning. Outside, rain can do what it likes. Inside,
your little bundles stay dry. And in that quiet protection, sleep can arrive, softly, steadily, and without hurry.
A birch-bark roof does not look like a fortress. It looks humble. Thin sheets, pale layers, a little uneven at the edges. And yet, in the right hands, it can keep a room dry through long, wet seasons. Not perfectly dry, not modern house dry, but dry enough. The kind of dryness that keeps bedding from molding and keeps a fire-starting bundle from turning into a wet lump of disappointment. Tonight, we'll move slowly across the top of a roof, step by quiet step, and learn what makes bark roofing work: overlap, direction, and the simple wisdom of letting water fall where it wants to fall. Why bark works on a roof. Bark resists soaking because it has natural oils and layered structure. Rain tends to bead and run off rather than seep straight through. But the larger secret of bark roofing isn't the bark's chemistry, it's the geometry. A bark roof is not a single sheet, it's a system of many sheets arranged so water always meets a downward path. The roof doesn't fight rain, it simply gives rain fewer chances to pause. When you build with bark, you build with the assumption that water is clever. You don't rely on one barrier, you rely on layers. Understructure, poles, and calm support. First comes the roof frame: rafters, purlins, cross poles. Depending on the region, it might be sturdy timber or slim poles. This frame creates the slope. Slope matters because bark is most waterproof when water is encouraged to move. A steepish roof sheds better. A flatter roof can still work, but it needs more overlap and more weight on top. In some places, the bark is laid under thatch or turf as a hidden waterproof skin. In others, it is part of the visible roof layer, sometimes covered with light poles or stones to keep the wind from lifting it. Laying the bark, like scales on a fish. Now picture the bark sheets themselves. They're often laid like shingles, starting low and moving upward. Each sheet overlaps the one below it, so rain runs over the edge rather than into the seam. It's like scales on a fish, but flatter and quieter. And there are two key rules: always overlap downhill, never align seams in vertical lines. If seams line up, water gains a straight road. So builders stagger the sheets, letting seams wander across the roof rather than stack. The bark is laid with care. Some builders prefer putting the outer bark side out, where water beads more. Others might choose the smoother side, depending on the sheet and the climate. Either way, edges are pressed down and arranged so they don't curl upward into little cups. Sometimes the bark is pinned with small wooden pegs. Sometimes it's held by light poles laid across, tied down. Sometimes stones are used in windy places. The goal is gentle pressure, not puncturing too much, not tearing, just persuading the bark to stay flat. Drip lines, sending water away from walls. A roof doesn't end at the top, it ends at the edge, and that edge decides whether the walls stay dry. Bark roof builders often create a clear drip line. The lower edge extends just enough that water falls away rather than running down the wall. Sometimes this is reinforced with a small lip, an extra strip of bark laid along the edge like a final gutter. In older structures, you might see dark staining on walls where drip lines were not perfect. In well-built ones, you see the opposite, a clean line where water leaves the roof and drops to the ground, forming a little trench or drip path that keeps the foundation from staying soaked. Ridge lines and the roof's weak spot. The roof peak, where two slopes meet, is the place water tries to enter during wind-driven rain, so the ridge gets special attention. Some builders lay a long ridge strip of bark over the top, like a cap. Others build a ridge sandwich, bark laid from both sides, then covered with another layer or weighted with poles. The ridge is sealed, sometimes with pitch, sometimes simply by careful overlap and pressure. If the ridge is done well, the roof becomes a calm instrument. Rain hits and leaves. If the ridge is done poorly, the roof becomes a quiet drip machine. And drips in a small house are a kind of slow misery. Damp spots on bedding, cold patches on shoulders, extra work to dry things by the hearth. So ridge work is not rushed, it's checked, it's maintained. Sound, the roof as a lullaby. Now let's pause for the most sleep-friendly part, the sound. A birch roof changes how rain sounds. On open leaves, rain is loud in bursts. On thatch, it can be a soft hiss. On bark, especially layered bark, it becomes muted, like rain through paper, like fingers drumming softly on a book cover. In a small cabin, you might hear a gentle tap-tap on the roof edges, a slow trickle at the drip line, occasional heavier drops where two sheets meet, and the steady hush of water moving off the surface. It's not silence, it's a controlled, softened weather sound. And this is part of why bark roofing feels cozy. It turns the outside world's wetness into a slow, predictable rhythm. Maintenance, the roof you revisit. Birch-bark roofs are not build once and forget. They are living roof systems. Wind can lift corners. Sun can dry and curl. Animals can disturb edges. So people check them seasonally. After a storm, someone might climb up, press down a lifted corner, slide in a fresh strip, add a pole for weight, smear a little pitch where needed. Small fixes keep the roof honest. And because bark is easy to harvest and store, repairs are usually possible without massive rebuilding. That is the quiet genius, waterproofing that is light enough to carry and simple enough to renew. A quiet ending image. Now imagine evening in a birch-roofed hut. The fire is small and steady. Outside, rain falls. Inside, the roof turns it into softness. You lie on bedding that stays mostly dry. Your tools are tucked nearby, wrapped in bark. The walls smell faintly of resin and smoke. You can hear water being guided away above your head. Overlaps doing their patient job. Drip lines sending rain back to earth. You don't have to stop the rain. You don't have to argue with the weather. The roof is already speaking politely to water for you. And in that gentle conversation, rain arriving, bark guiding it away, you can let your thoughts settle, like droplets sliding down a pale sheet and disappearing into the dark ground outside.
Birch bark is naturally resistant to water, but humans rarely leave nature as is when they can make it steadier. A roof seam needs more than overlap. A canoe needs more than good bark. A container needs more than a tight fold. So people added another quiet helper, resin. Tree sap cooked into pitch, warmed into glue, pressed into gaps until water had nowhere easy to go. Tonight, we're going to stay with that slow, sticky craft, sealing, smoothing, and letting things cool. Where resin comes from. In forests where birch grows, other trees often grow too. Spruce, pine, fir, larch. These conifers bleed resin when their bark is wounded. You can find it as amber lumps on trunks, hardened in little tears and streaks. Sometimes it's collected slowly, a little at a time, as people walk their usual routes. Sometimes it's gathered after storms, when branches break and sap flows. Picture someone in a damp forest with a small knife. They stop at a spruce with old resin tears, careful not to harm the tree more than necessary. They scrape off hardened lumps into a birch-bark cup. The resin smells sharp, clean, bright, almost like cold sunlight. It sticks to fingers. It catches on cloth. Resin, raw, can be too brittle, too glass-like, too quick to crack. So people learn to cook it. Gently heat it until it softens and changes character, becoming pitch, more flexible and more willing to bond. Birch bark as the perfect little pot. Here's one of the nicest quiet loops in this whole topic. Birch bark helps make the very waterproof sealant used to seal birch bark. A person can fold birch bark into a small cup or tray, light, quick, disposable. They can set it near a small fire, not directly in flame, and melt resin inside it. The bark doesn't immediately burn, because the heat is moderate and the resin absorbs some of it. The cup might darken and curl at the edges, but it holds long enough to do the job. So you imagine a tiny work scene, a fire the size of a dinner plate, a birch cup warmed beside it, resin slowly turning glossy and liquid, like honey darkening. Making pitch tougher. In many traditions, pitch isn't only resin, it's resin plus something. People mixed in charcoal dust from hearth ash, which strengthens it and helps it resist cracking, fine ash or mineral dust, which can change texture and drying behavior, animal fat or oil, which can add flexibility in cold weather. There isn't one universal recipe. Different forests produce different resins. Different climates demand different flexibility, so the recipe is often learned by feel. Too brittle, add fat. Too soft, add charcoal. Too sticky, cook a bit longer. It's quiet kitchen logic, just applied to waterproofing. Seams, where water tries to sneak in. Now imagine the object being sealed. A birch-bark container, folded corners, stitched edge, lid overlap. A roof patch, bark shingles layered east-west to throw rain downward. A canoe, long ribs under tension, bark sheets stitched, seams running like rivers along the hull. Every one of these has seams, and seams are where water starts its conversations. Water doesn't usually break through the middle of a good bark sheet. It probes edges. It lingers where one piece meets another. It follows stitching holes. It finds tiny gaps and waits. So the sealing work is done with care. A small wooden spatula, a bone spoon, even a flat stick is dipped into warmed pitch. The pitch is pressed into the seam, not painted loosely, but pushed in, like filling a crack in stone. Then it's smoothed along the edge, creating a continuous line that water can't easily climb. The motion is repetitive and satisfying. Press, drag, smooth, lift. Press, drag, smooth, lift. If you listen closely, you can hear it, a faint sticky sound like soft wax. Heat control, the most important skill. Too hot, and pitch runs everywhere, dripping, leaving thin spots. Too cool, and pitch clumps, refusing to spread, cracking later. So people worked close to small fires, warming the pitch only as needed. They might carry a small ember in a bark tray, or keep a pot near coals. They might re-warm the seam after pressing, letting it flow just enough to settle. And then they let it cool. Cooling is part of the craft. A seam that is still warm is vulnerable.
You don't flex it too soon. You don't launch the canoe too soon. You don't hang the bark lid in the rain before the pitch has set into its final firmness. So there is waiting again. Quiet waiting. The smell of a dry thing being made. Pitch has a smell that sticks in memory. Warm resin is sharp and sweet, like pine needles crushed between fingers. It's the smell of clean wood made stronger. In smoky air, it becomes deeper, almost comforting. In a small workshop space, that smell mixes with birch-bark's faint paper scent. Together, they create a scent that says, "This will hold." Maintenance. Waterproofing as ongoing care. A birch canoe doesn't stay sealed forever without attention. Roof bark can lift in storms. Containers can dry and loosen in heat. Waterproofing is not a one-time act, it's seasonal care. So people kept pitch-making knowledge close. They knew where to find resin. They kept charcoal dust. They kept small birch cups ready. They knew how to warm a seam without ruining it. In spring, you check the canoe seams before ice-out travel. In autumn, you check roof shingle overlaps before long rain. Before a journey, you check your bark container lid. Small checks prevent big leaks. A sleepy picture to end on. Now, to help you drift, take one calm image and hold it gently. Picture a small fire in a forest clearing after rain. The ground is damp. The air smells green. Two people sit close to the coals, sheltered by a simple lean-to. One holds a birch-bark cup, where resin melts slowly. The other presses pitch along a canoe seam, smoothing it with a flat stick. Everything is quiet except tiny sounds. The soft breathing of the fire, the occasional drip from leaves, the gentle, sticky drag of pitch on bark. The seam darkens as it fills. The line becomes continuous. Water has fewer places to hide. In your own mind, you can imagine doing the same, filling the seams where stress leaks in, smoothing the edges of the day, sealing up the small cracks so you're not constantly being drenched by tiny worries. You don't need a big fire for that. Just a small, steady warmth, breathing, calm, time. Press, smooth, settle. Press, smooth, settle. And then, like pitch cooling into place, you can let yourself become still.
If birch bark is a quiet shield against wet weather, the first question is gentle and practical. How do you get it? And more importantly, how do you get it without turning a useful tree into a dead one? Because people who depended on birch understood something very early. A good material isn't only something you can take once. It's something you can return to season after season without breaking the place that provides it. So tonight we step into the calm craft of harvesting bark. The right time of year. Bark doesn't peel the same way all year. In many northern climates, there is a sweet season, usually late spring into early summer, when sap is running, and the bark separates more easily from the wood beneath. In that time, a careful person can lift a sheet with less tearing, less struggle, and less damage. In winter, bark can be brittle. In late autumn, it can cling too tightly. In the right season, it releases with a soft, papery sigh. Imagine a bright but cool morning in late spring. The forest floor is still damp from melting snow and early rains, but new green is showing everywhere. Ferns unfurling, small leaves opening like quiet hands. Birch trunks glow pale in the shade, dotted with dark scars and horizontal lines. A person walks among them, not with greed, but with selection. They look for a tree that is large enough, healthy enough, and positioned where taking a strip won't weaken it dangerously. Sometimes they choose fallen birch, storm-thrown or already dying, so the harvest harms nothing living. Fallen birch is a gift, bark already loosened, wood already surrendered. But when strong bark is needed, wide sheets for roofing, canoe skins, large containers, people may harvest from living trees with careful rules. The most important rule: never ring the tree. If you cut bark all the way around a trunk, you cut the tree's lifeline. That ring interrupts the flow beneath the bark and can kill the tree. People who lived with birch learned to avoid this. They did not always use modern biology words, but they understood the result. So the cut is made in a way that keeps the tree alive. A vertical cut is made, sometimes with a short horizontal cut at top and bottom, forming a panel. The panel is lifted gently, keeping edges smooth. The rest of the bark remains intact around the trunk, so the tree can continue its work. The harvested area may scar, and the tree may never look perfect again, but it can survive and sometimes be harvested again years later if it remains healthy. This is quiet sustainability long before the word existed. Tools: simple, sharp, gentle. The tools are usually basic: a small knife, a bone or wooden wedge, sometimes a specialized bark-peeling tool. Metal blades became common in many places as trade increased, but earlier methods worked too: sharp stone, carefully shaped bone. The essential skill isn't the tool, it's the pressure. Too rough and you tear the bark into useless strips. Too deep and you cut into the living layer beneath, harming the tree and staining the bark with wet wood fibers. Too shallow and the bark refuses to lift. The right pressure is a practiced whisper of force. Picture hands working at the trunk. The blade draws a clean vertical line. Then a wedge slides under the outer layer. The bark begins to separate, first stubbornly, then more smoothly. In a good harvest, the panel lifts like a page being turned. Choosing the best bark. Not all bark is equal. People learned the quiet differences. Some bark is thick and layered, good for roofs and large containers. Some bark is thin and papery, best for tinder and quick wraps. Bark closer to the base can be rougher. Bark higher on the trunk can be smoother. Bark from older trees might have more texture and scars from weather. A skilled harvester doesn't just take bark. They take the right bark for the job they have in mind. You can imagine someone stacking sheets carefully. Each one is rolled gently, inner side protected, edges aligned. Bark is light, but if you crease it sharply, it remembers that crease forever. So it is treated like cloth or paper, rolled, tied, and carried with care. Resting and flattening. Fresh bark can curl. It wants to return to the shape of the tree it came from. To make it useful, people often flatten it. Some methods are simple. Lay it under boards with stones as weights. Store it rolled, then unroll and warm it near a hearth to relax it. Soak briefly and then press flat, depending on the intended use. The goal is not to fight the bark, but to persuade it. In a warm interior, bark softens slightly. Near gentle heat, it becomes more cooperative. Too much heat, and it dries too fast in cracks. Again, quiet balance. Respect and household rules. In many traditional settings, bark harvesting was governed by small community rules, spoken, not written. Don't strip young trees. Don't take too much from one area. Leave enough for the forest to recover. Harvest after storms when possible. Share good stands. Because when you depend on bark as waterproofing, boxes, roofing, and sometimes boats, you can't afford to ruin your supply. So the craft becomes part of seasonal life, like haymaking, like net mending, like peat cutting. Bark time arrives, people work, bark is stored, and then the forest is left alone again. A sleepy moment in the birch stand. Now let's slow down and just sit with the image. Imagine the quiet sound of bark lifting, soft, papery, almost like a page turning in a library. Imagine sunlight filtering through fresh leaves. Imagine the pale trunk under the removed panel, damp and alive, and the person pausing before they tie the bark roll and move on. No rushing. The forest doesn't like rushing. If rain begins, it's fine, because you're harvesting the very thing that talks politely to rain. Drops bead on the outer bark, slide off. The roll stays mostly protected. You walk back to the settlement carrying your bundle. It's light on your shoulder, like carrying dryness itself, like carrying a future roof patch, a future container, a future canoe seam. And tonight in your own room, you can borrow that feeling, that you have gathered something calm and useful, and you can put it away for later. You don't have to fix every leak in life right now. You can simply harvest the right material, patience, store it gently, and rest.